the last time that you spent time with someone from a different country? Had a conversation with someone with a different mother tongue? Or spent time with someone from a different generation, just because? And no, I don't mean your parents or your grandparents. Can you think of a time when you went out of your way to engage with someone, not because you thought you had a lot in common, but because you were different in some way? Growing up, I always wanted to be a scientist. My father's an epileptologist, and while I didn't know exactly what one does in that role, I wanted to be a scientist like Dad. And so I spent quite a bit of time doing math competitions and science fairs, from elementary school right on up through high school. You could say I was a bit of a blurred, a black nerd. During my undergrad in science, I missed the date to enroll for a statistics for health sciences class, and so I was relegated to the statistics for social sciences and art students. Oh man, was I even woke enough to be taking classes with social sciences and art students? Would I just spend time doing things like learning themes of essays and exercises in self-expression? But it turned out that rather than the computational aspects of the course, I actually began to fall in love with the subject matter: factors affecting social and economic inequality. While I sometimes felt stifled in my science classes, I felt like I could really see the big picture when it came to the humanities. And while I did enjoy learning about the cells and the biology of the individual, I was just as interested in that person's role in wider society. Concepts like social structure, individual agency, and repression were things that I could really relate to the world around me. In fact, it was because of a growing appreciation for the social determinants of health that I decided to pursue medicine as a career, rather than pure sciences. What began as a serendipitous event would actually have major reverberations going forward. This rooting in the humanities has made me a better doctor today. My experience is neither unique nor unexpected, because it's often the case that when we reach out to people that are different from us in some way, creativity and innovation ensue. This phenomenon is known as the edge effect. So the edge effect gets its name because it's at the intersection of two distinct ecosystems, like the tall, broadleaf trees of the rainforest and the vast, vegetation-laden grasslands of the savanna, that the greatest number of unique organisms can be found. Researchers analyzed millions of scientific papers over a 20-year period. First, they looked at the diversity of the authorship in terms of the ethnicity of the authors and the locations of their research institutions. Next, they wanted to know whether authors that write papers with more diversity were more likely to find their papers in well-read journals, or more likely to have other scientific papers reference them. And in fact, that's exactly what they found. So indeed, it was the papers with greater diversity among their authorship that were more likely to be found in high-yield journals and to be referenced by other scientific papers. Okay, so how do we apply the edge effect to our day-to-day lives? Well, one natural place to start would be to look at those closest to us. And so I want each of you to think of 6 or 7 people that make up your inner circle, people outside of work that you spend the most time with. We might find that our inner circles are a bit less diverse than we'd like to think, but don't take my word for it. Another study asked participants to think of 7 people outside of their family that they spend the most time with in the previous year. And of those confidants, they asked about their age, gender, and ethnicity. And it turned out that for them, their social circles weren't entirely that diverse. For example, of white respondents, over 90% of their social circles were made up by other white people. And the results for other ethnicities were similar. So now, I want each of you to think back to the people that make up your inner circle. Do you think you could use a different perspective? But spending time with people that are similar to us is not something to be ashamed of or to feel bad about. In fact, it's very common. Maybe it's easier to spend time with Mike, who also works in the IT department, or with Sally, who grew up just around the corner from us. Or maybe it's more than that. We each have times when we're just afraid we'll say the wrong thing, or that we might not have something useful to offer someone at all. And it's precisely because it's so common that I challenge each of you to go out of your way and see what can happen when different perspectives collide. A collision like the cool Labrador Current coming down off the Arctic Ocean as it meets the warm Gulf Stream coming up just off the coast of Florida. It's the nutrients from each of these sources that's needed to produce one of the richest fishing grounds in the entire world at the Grand Banks. And this has yielded a resource that's been so important in the history of Newfoundland and Labrador. Growing up as a science nerd, I learned from a very early age that the right side of the brain was more associated with creativity and free thought, while the left side more with rational and analytical thinking. Well, what can happen if we use a little bit of both? Well, a few years ago, I gave a talk to scientists about how they can leverage social media to increase the reach of their research. Now, while they were all experts in their fields, they were also aware that their data doesn't exactly make front-page news. After all, there's nothing scandalous about disease pathways, and arthritis research just doesn't have that pizzazz, you know? And so they enlisted me. In fact, they were similar to a grandmother who included please and thank you in her Google search, which is endearing, but unnecessary. So here I was, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter 101 in front of this group of scientists. Social media meet the scientific method. Hypotheses meet hashtags. The edge effect is very much tied to innovation. Innovation is any product, service, or process that's new and useful to society in some way, and it goes hand in hand with entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs like my mother, who brought West African and Afro-American beauty ideals to Newfoundland in the 1980s. Now, while weaves and hair extensions were very common in some of the communities that my family had lived in before coming here to Newfoundland, they weren't really a thing here in the 1980s. And so my mother saw this as an opportunity to bridge the different cultures and bring new services and products. But besides just bringing new products, she also brought a fresh perspective. That just because you have artificial products in your hair doesn't make you any less authentic as a person. Did you know that the stethoscope, the quintessential symbol of medicine, was only discovered because the doctor that first used it had been a flute player in a previous life? French physician and musician René Laennec discovered that principles of sound amplification through his flute could be applied to listen to sounds made by the human heart and the human lungs. Pointillism is an art form in which thousands of tiny dots are each arranged in such a way that they create a larger, beautiful image. This concept was snagged by eye doctors in making tests for color blindness. But even if you can see that 29 perfectly there, you're still probably benefiting from this art form because it's also used in the pixelation needed in the display of our beloved smartphones. The edge effect is even relevant in the world of music. Now, while we often see music as a classical example of creativity, what if I told you that there are now entire musical albums in which every single note is made not by some musical genius or virtuoso, but by artificial intelligence? Even if we look at fashion, the success of many European fashion houses has been associated with the sheer amount of time that the artistic director has spent abroad. So, I don't mean just the number of countries as if they're cataloging them on a list, but the sheer amount of time immersed in different cultures. So, I'm not saying that you need to find the next Swahili-speaking Scandinavian to join your new Highland dance class, or to master that new Persian dish while getting your hair braided by your new jiu-jitsu fighting hairstylist. Because, yes, while our efforts often have to be deliberate, they must be genuine. Now, while it may seem daunting, you can start small. one thing I did was by looking at my social media consumption. I realized that through my newsfeed, I was following a lot of accounts with viewpoints that I already agreed with. In fact, I felt like I was in an electronic echo chamber with every like, share, comment, retweet, thumbs up emoji, and yes, serving as a virtual high five. And so I decided to follow accounts that I didn't necessarily see eye to eye with. You see, we each have areas of growth, but we also have unique perspectives and experiences that we can leverage to find solutions to many different problems. So, for those of you in charge of hiring, I urge you to see diversity not as some checklist item, but as a true competitive advantage. Consider taking on that intern with overseas experience and seeing this as a benefit in terms of perspective rather than a hindrance in terms of integration. Or someone with life experience that can't be whittled down to just 3 letters like BSc or MBA. Or why not take a chance on someone like my mother, who brought not just new products to the table, but new perspectives as well. I think back to that 18-year-old science student stumbling into that sociology class many years ago, and all the opportunities that were only possible because he embraced a different way of thinking. In this age of globalization, the world is getting smaller and smaller. Collaboration is always within our grasp, and diversity is literally all around us. So the next time you have the opportunity to collaborate with someone unlike yourself in some way, run towards it, because you'll never know what's on the other side. Thank you.